Okay, hello, my name is Rachel Lastoff. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a licensed clinician in the states of Massachusetts, North Carolina, Ohio, and Kentucky. I own Life Informed Therapy, which is online and in-person counseling practice. I have an office in Newport. So I specialize in eating disorders, trauma, life transitions, and gender-affirming care. And I'm also a secular therapist. I identify as atheist. So I want to talk a little bit about um, secular therapy, sex positivity, gender affirming care, and action steps that we can take. So Chrissy reached out to me. Go back. So Chrissy reached out to me about providing secular therapy. I was, just a little bit about me, I was raised Jewish. Well, I am Jewish, but like we were sort of holiday Jews. I grew up in New England, and in where we lived, obviously there's a huge, more Roman Catholic population, but we were just raised kind of like, I don't know, we just want to eat Chinese food on the holidays. So that's kind of my religious experience. And then my grad school was actually at a Catholic school, but again, in New England, religion wasn't ever really brought up. And, if a client wants to talk about religion, that's fine because they're bringing it to the therapy session, but a therapist would never really bring religion into counseling. We have in New Hampshire a license called the Pastoral Counseling License, and Kentucky has one as well. And that's basically for people who want to have like a religious aspect to their counseling. So because I was not a pastoral counselor, when I practiced in New England, I didn't bring religion in, and it didn't really need to be said that I was a secular therapist. And then when I moved to North Carolina, I moved to Asheville, which is again like the blue little island in the Red Sea. So again, being a secular therapist wasn't something that you actually had to say, it was just assumed. Then when I moved here, I realized that I very much need to say that I'm a secular therapist because it's definitely not the norm to not bring religion into therapy. And since I've sort of been saying like I'm a secular therapist, I'm getting a lot more religious and non-religious people for several reasons that I'm going to go over. The sexual positivity and the gender affirming care is a huge piece about why I'm seeing kind of both sides in clients. And I'm going to go over some action steps that you can take if you're interested in kind of helping people who are really repressed under more religious counseling. Okay. So secular therapy is, people always ask, like, well, what is secular therapy? And I always bring up, like, well, it's more about what it isn't. And what it isn't is any therapy that's based on religion. So when we talk about issues that are happening, we're not leaving it up to God. We're not praying about it. I tell my clients all the time, like, I care about you, but I'm not going to pray for you. So they find that to be more welcoming because they always get like thoughts and prayers, and that's really invalidating for them, especially if that's not something that's helpful. So my approach is very reality based. Can I swear in here? Okay. so I tell clients when I see bullshit, I'll call it out, and a lot of people like that. It's we're in the moment, we're not leaving things up to fate. We're working on skills that we can utilize here and now. So DBT is where most of my training is, and that stands for Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. It was developed by a psychologist named Marsha Linehan. She actually struggled with extreme suicidality. She was institutionalized for a long time, and she realized that none of the treatment was helping, so she developed dialectical behavioral therapy. And I was trained in a hospital that worked with people that struggled with a lot of suicidality and self-harm, but then we realized this is going to be used outside there. So it focuses on mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. And so when people come with, they're grieving without God, that's one of the big things that we work with. We talk about like mindfulness as staying present at the moment. Not necessarily like a meditation aspect, but not kind of worrying about like what's happening in the future because we can't control that, and nor that what's happened in the past. I also utilize humor a lot in my sessions. So memes are a big thing for me. My clients like to share a lot of memes, and I reference them all the time. But there was a study in 2016 that showed that people who could laugh with others knew that the interaction was safe. So when we talk about people who have experienced a lot of trauma, they're super hyper vigilant. Their arousal level is very high. They're constantly wondering, is this a safe situation? So if you can get somebody to laugh, even just for 30 seconds, so 30 seconds that they are no longer hyper vigilant in that state. So we utilize a lot of humor. There's also some research done in Australia about people who watch a funny video clip before they do a task that it seems like really tedious and something that they can't do, actually spent twice as long trying to attempt to complete that task versus somebody that just watched like a neutral or a positive video. So when you think of somebody who has depression, somebody who's really struggling to get out of bed, take a shower, go to work, I always say, okay, like, what do you find funny? What can you watch right before? So I don't know how many times I prescribe people to watch like The Office or Parks and Rec before they want to do something, because it helps get them once laughing and also like sort of moving and out the door. The other aspect is swearing. So swearing is a big part of my therapy approach. I actually have a sign on my wall that says like maybe swearing would help. And there's research showing that swearing helps increase endorphins. It reduces pain, and it also gives people a sense of control. So when you think about people who've experienced trauma or when really repressive relationships or repressive religions, swearing was definitely not something that was allowed. So when people can swear, they're taking more control over their body and their autonomy. So these are sort of my approaches in secular therapy, and the benefits of that is people are living in the moment, there's less shame and judgment, and there's sex positive and gender affirming focus for a lot of people, because that is where I'm seeing a lot of my clients in terms of feeling a lot of shame, feeling a lot of guilt, especially when people are recovering from religion. I think most people know about the Secular Therapy Project. Yeah, so I get just a ton of people from there that are recovering from a religion, and the biggest thing is that they feel a lot of shame about their sexuality, things that they've done, things that they want to do that they can't feel like they can do. So that is one aspect. That's a huge aspect of my practice. Okay. So, sex and gender. So I have the two schools of thought. I think you can see which is which. So we have, this is a secular view of sex and gender, and this is the more religious. Now, obviously not a ton of wiggle room over there. You kind of have to fit in these little boxes. Whereas here, I mean, this is where we get ourselves. So when we look at female and male up there, so that's basically your sex. And when you're born, a doctor looks to see if there's a penis or vagina, and then they make the decision if you're male or female. Or if you have indistinguishable genitalia, then you're intersex, and then they kind of toss a coin and decide what they're going to do. Which now they're sort of stopping that, and they're trying to delay surgery so that people are not being assigned a gender based on just what the doctor or the parents want to do. So when I get people that come to me, they're not fitting into these perfectly little boxes here. Everything is on a spectrum. So, we talk about gender fluid, how you're expressing yourself, what your orientation is, and it's very difficult for people who are raised in really religious backgrounds to say, I identify as female, but I'm more, but I have a masculine gender expression, and maybe I'm bisexual. So we're not really fitting into these boxes, and there's a lot of shame about that. So they come to me for more secular therapy because I ignore everything that's over there. Like, that means nothing to me. I want to know where you are on this chart because it is very fluid. And where you were at one point in your life, you may not be anymore. So, okay, so here are some gems from the Bible that I have pulled out, sort of about the religious messages that people get when we talk about sex. And the one that I get a lot is the wives submit to your husbands as to the Lord. This is huge when I get couples counseling because they usually have gone to a couples counselor that comes from a religious background, and it leads to a lot of resentment, and it didn't work. You know, when there's some disagreement about like sex drive, and they're just being told, well, you just have to have sex with each other, which can be extremely traumatic for somebody who's asexual or has had a sexual assault in their past, which is something that we'll talk about. Next slide. So here is a secular approach to sex. You have to have these three things. It has to be safe, it has to be enjoyable, and it has to be consensual. You cannot have a healthy sex life if one of these things are missing, because it can be safe and consensual, but it's not enjoyable, then that's not positive. So we need to explore what that looks like. It can be enjoyable, consensual, but it's not safe. So then we got to talk about STIs, pregnancy, or other physical things that can happen. This is obviously not religious based. And I think that's where some people, this is where people really need to know that sex is a positive thing, but it has to have these three aspects to it. So we work a lot with the LGBT community when, there's a lot of shame about, having poly relationships, same-sex relationships, whatever it is, does it match these three things? If it does, then you're okay. So we're talking, yeah. So when we talk about sex positivity, a lot of times I get couples that say, we're really struggling with our sex life, and I ask, like, well, what are you doing? And it's usually the same thing. It is leads to penetration, male orgasm, and then it's over. And so we talk about, like, well, what else are you doing? Because heteronormative sex really focuses on reproduction, but that doesn't work for everybody, and that's not everybody's goal. So we're able to talk more about other things that couples can do that does not just involve penetration. Sex workers and sex surrogates. Sex workers do need to have therapy, and it is a valid piece of work. So I see a lot of people who are shamed because they do sex work, but if it is decriminalized, then they can get health care, and they can have protection against workplace violence. Sex surrogates are trained individuals that work with therapists for people who struggle with having sexual relationships. So it is a gray area in terms of, some people say it's sort of like sex work, which it is, but it doesn't always end up in sex. And it's very helpful for people that are coming out of the purity culture. So I work with a lot of 20, 30, 40-year-olds that are still virgins and are not able to approach other people and are very lonely and looking for partners because they were taught for so long that, sex is this thing that you cannot have with anybody else other than the partner that you're going to marry. And while they were able to leave the religion, because heaven and hell is something that's intangible and that's like, okay, well, I can sort of dismiss that. That's not real. But sex is real. Sex is tangible. We see it, when they're watching porn, like, I know that exists, and I don't know how to get to it because they were never taught how to have normal interactions with people that they're attracted to. Not to mention, if they may be attracted to somebody of the same sex, that's another issue. So that's where a sex surrogate could come in and be helpful with working in tandem with a therapist to say, like, how do you approach somebody? How do you respect boundaries? How do you share that you need to go slower because you're not as experienced? It also helps with people who have erectile dysfunction or pelvic floor pain. So that's another part of sex positivity. And then sex positivity doesn't just focus on people who want to have sex, it's also people who don't want to have sex, and that's people who are asexual. There are a lot of people that don't want to have sex, but they want to have romantic relationships, but they didn't know that there was a term for that, and that is what asexual is. So when you have that couple that maybe somebody is asexual in that relationship, but have to be submissive to their partner, that's pretty traumatic. And we talk about, well, if you want to be in this relationship because usually they love their partner, they don't want to get a divorce, but they don't want to have sex, then they say, okay, let's open the relationship up so their partner can have their sexual needs met. And again, when you come from a religious background, opening up a relationship is like, well, what's wrong with their relationship? Like, nothing's wrong with their relationship, but their sexual needs have changed. And so, especially when you have people that were married younger, maybe got married at 18, 19, well, there's an evolution there. Their sexual needs may have changed when they're 40s, and that's when they probably want to open up a relationship. And then the biggest part is the LGBTQ community. That is probably the biggest victim of religious-based therapy. It is something that I see the most of, and it's really where I want to kind of focus more attention on. So here's some religious messages about the LGBTQ community. And so the first one I think is about, the first and second I think are more about like the trans community. And then obviously we all know that middle one, which they use for gay marriage. And so these are the messages that the LGBTQ community is hearing still to this day. It's still an issue, especially now that the trans community is becoming more visible. We're getting a lot of pushback. And so even though this was written thousands of years ago, we still have a lot of stuff going on right now that is really punishing the trans and the gay community. So I'm sure we've all heard of conversion or reparative therapy, which is not therapy. The American Counseling Association, the American Psychological Association, National Association of Social Workers have all come out and said, this is not therapy, this is not condoned. Only 18 states have banned conversion therapy, but the problem is that's only for licensed therapists. So anybody else can do conversion therapy. They have conversion therapy camps, and although I have heard that they're a really good place to pick up people from other clients. So, but it is physical, mental, and emotional abuse. So I've heard people say that they will show them like same-sex like pornography and then physically abuse them while they're watching it so that they make the correlation between being aroused and pain. And this is, so the LGBTQ community already has a higher rate of suicide compared to their straight cisgender counterparts. If they go to conversion therapy, they're 8 times more likely to commit suicide. And it is no surprise that the person that basically started conversion therapy has come out as gay. So I think we all saw that coming. Next slide, please. So, and again, the effects of non-affirming support. So for trans community, I guess you can't see that. For trans individuals, 50% have thought about suicide. That's 1.8 million people are trans in the United States. So half of those people have thought about suicide. And the two main reasons is lack of parental support and bullying. So if you think about conversion therapy, now you're adding 8 times that onto their already high suicide risk. This is the Trevor Project. They have a suicide hotline, and so obviously they get the most calls from the Midwest and the South. In the Midwest, the highest state is Indiana, and they consider in the South is Kentucky. They get the most calls for suicide prevention. So which everyone talks about, like, well, suicide prevention, like, what is it, walk up the night or something like that. But nobody really focuses on, like, how damaging conversion therapy or a lot of these policies are that the Trump administration is doing on the LGBTQ community. There's a lot of veterans that are concerned about their safety that are, while the VA will actually pay for hormone replacement therapy, they will not pay for gender-affirming surgery. You have the bathroom bills that are trying to be passed. Planned Parenthood does hormone replacement therapy, so obviously people are also losing that access. Next slide. So my role as a therapist is providing gender-affirming care. And in the beginning, the therapist actually in the trans community had a very contentious relationship because we were put in this position to basically decide if somebody was trans enough before we would write letters for them to get either hormone replacement therapy, gender-affirming care, or a letter to change their gender marker. It is not my role to decide if somebody's trans enough. I mean, some people actually had to wait 2 years and dress either ultra feminine or ultra masculine before a therapist would say, like, yes, I will write a letter for you, which is really ridiculous, because if you remember the spectrum, I mean, cisgendered women do not have to dress ultra feminine to be considered women, but yet we were putting that on trans people to sort of prove their femininity or masculinity. So our approach it used to be a gatekeeper role. Like, therapists were gatekeepers to keeping trans people from getting the affirming treatment that they needed. I think we all remember several years ago in the DSM that being gay was a mental health disorder that we had a diagnosis for. That has been taken out, luckily, but trans is in there, and that is considered gender identity dysphoria. Unfortunately, it's not a mental health issue, but we have to diagnose people so that they can get insurance coverage for a lot of this treatment. But we all kind of know it's bullshit. Like, a lot of people are trans and do not feel upset about it, because they're just kind of going through, like, okay, like, I'm trans, I need to get this done, this done, this done. They have other issues, but I have to identify them as having a disorder, even though we all know that's not really the issue. The issue is that what society is putting in the barriers in place for them, and that's giving them a lot of hurdles. I mean, you can go to a plastic surgeon and say, I want to look like Barbie, and nobody makes them go through, all these therapy sessions before they can have plastic surgery, or a face tattoo, or even having a baby. These are all permanent things, but somehow for trans individuals, they are made to jump through all these hoops to get the care that they need. So we're taking a more informed consent role, which is listen, validate, and trust. So when I have somebody coming in and says, I want a letter for hormone replacement therapy or to have surgery, I listen to their story. As long as they're not high or drunk, manic or psychotic, then I'm gonna write their letter. And I tell them, even if they are, because people with addiction can be trans, people who are psychotic can be trans, people who are bipolar can be trans. I say, when we'll work together to get you to a place where that you're in a good mindset, but I'm still gonna write that letter. Validating, experiencing, and trusting, like, this is what they need and this is what they want. There's always stories about, well, people detransition. And so I think it's less than 1% of people who detransition. And when they do a survey about why, it's usually because it's unsafe for them to be transitioned. So they transition fully, and either they're not accepted by their family or their community, their job, and it was sort of safer for them to kind of go back. So that's really the reason that most people detransition. Next slide. So what you can do to help. The first and easiest thing is pronouns. So as you know, I introduced myself, said she, her pronouns. We want to get into the habit of introducing ourselves with our pronouns. And you could even put it in your email signature. It's because we want people to feel safe to say that this is my pronoun now. And I know people like, oh, I forgot, or they changed their name. When I got married, people were calling me Mrs. Tessier. And I'm like, who the fuck is that? It's like, I didn't even ask anyone to change my name, but yet people were so quick to use my husband's last name. So it's really about mindset. If someone says, this is my name now, these are my pronouns, use them. Because there's a lot of studies that show just by using the correct pronouns decreases the risk of suicide. And if you do slip up, what trans people have told me is that do not make long apologies and reasons why that you accidentally slipped up. Just, oh, I'm sorry, use the right pronoun and move on, because then then the trans person has to sort of console you, even though you were the one that misgendered them. So just correct yourself and move forward. Gender neutral bathrooms. I think, remember the North Carolina bathroom bill, which was a disaster. So if you own a business or know of a business, and they have like a single stall, even if they don't have single stalls. We go to conferences all the time at hotels and conferences that are multi-stall. They just cover the male, female, put gender neutral, and people just come and go with the bathrooms. And there's zero sexual assault, which is amazing. So if you can talk to somebody, a business, and say, can you put a gender neutral sign on this bathroom? 69% of trans individuals avoid eating or drinking or going places because they're afraid they won't have a bathroom to use. which can lead to UTIs, missed work, missed school, and other issues. So I'm sure we've all been out running errands and they have to use the bathroom. So imagine that you can't, or you're afraid to, or you're going to be bullied or harassed. So gender neutral bathrooms is a big thing that we're trying to push for. So I have one in my office, but if you know of any place that you can ask them, it would be really great and much appreciated. So Kentucky is trying to ban conversion therapy. They have two bills up, HB 221 and SB 248. So I think it's banconversiontherapykentucky.org. If you go to their website, you can call your legislator and ask them to support that ban. Again, it's only for licensed clinicians, but it's still one step closer to what we need in terms of protecting youth. In Ohio, you cannot change your gender marker on your birth certificate, which leads to a huge barrier because if you can think of everything that you need to do with an ID. So let's say you've transitioned, but your gender marker has your old gender, or your birth certificate has your old gender on it. How do you think you're going to get on a plane, get a job, get a loan, have any other, like a driver's license? I think Ohio is one of 3 states. So the ACLU did sue, and I think it's sort of like, I'm not sure where it is in courts right now, but if you want to follow that, I think it's, what is it? Something Hines. Ray versus Hines. Yeah. And then in Indiana, so you can change your birth certificate. Conversion therapy is still legal there, and doesn't look like there's any attempts to change that, but they also have no anti-discrimination policies in place, unfortunately. And then if you could click on the link to Point of Pride, hopefully, if you have internet. So if you're looking to make donations, this is a really wonderful organization. Okay, so Point of Pride donates free binders, free trans femme shapewear, electrolysis, financial support, and they have an annual surgery fund. So when we have to diagnose somebody with gender identity dysphoria, being trans and maybe not, so if you are a trans man and you have breasts, then that could be extremely anxiety provoking, especially if you are out somewhere where you are presenting as male and somebody may recognize that you have breasts. So a binder actually flattens your chest to make you feel that is until you can have like top surgery. And they can be kind of expensive, so they donate them for free to anybody that needs them. And the nice thing is, if you contact them and make a donation, you can actually ask them to donate a binder to somebody in your area. It's like, so when I went to a conference a conference in Philadelphia, they had a map, and they had like where people had been requesting binders, and you could just sort of pick where you wanted to donate. So I picked like a really rural place. I was like, that person should get a binder. And then the trans femme shapewear. So when you are trans female and you start taking estrogen, you're going to grow breasts, and bras are really expensive. So this kind of grows with you to give you a little bit of support, and the underwear helps keep like a smooth area, so when you're tucking, there's no bulge there. And because trans females actually have the highest rate of violence towards them, especially trans women of color. There's been 18 women that have been murdered this year strictly because they were trans women of color. So not only are these helping their gender dysphoria, but it's also a safety precaution for them. And then the electrolysis financial support program, if they're so it does help with facial hair for trans women, but if you're going to have bottom surgery like a phalloplasty or a vaginoplasty, you have to have electrolysis done for a year before you can have surgery. And the reason behind that is when they take skin grafts and they reconstruct, if there's any hair follicle, that will regrow, and even if it's internal. So the hair has to be gone, and that can be really expensive. So they do a lot of financial support towards that, as well as just the transgender surgery fund. So then they take, they've given away a lot of money, but I can't remember how many it is. I think they do every quarter, they donate to individuals that need financial support to do gender affirming surgery. And that is it. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Okay, I've heard that children, when would a child know that they want to be, that they're a different gender than they were identified as at birth?
Mm-hmm.
About what age would they decide that?
And I've heard, I've had parents say, like, since they started talking and being able to identify, like, toys or what they want, who they want to be with, as young as 4. But then I've had people that didn't realize until much older, usually because of a lot of, it's unsafe for them to do that. Even if they felt something that was, like, completely repressed, until they left whatever it was that was repressing those feelings. But, it's pretty much as young as 4. Kids know. And I think the nice thing about being more open about talking about gender fluid is kids now have words to put to what they're feeling. I have a lot of older clients. I have people up to the age of 70 that are just starting to transition because they said back then they had no idea what it was. They just knew that it was sort of different. They always thought, well, maybe I'm just gay, but really they're trans. And I have some parents that say, I thought my child was gay, but I was not expecting them to be trans. So kids know pretty young, especially if you give them the opportunity to explore that. That's why these gender reveal parties are so ridiculous. Because we're saying, like, well, this is how you're going to be when you really don't know. We don't know until they're able to express themselves and identify how they really are. Mm-hmm.
You've heard of, I guess, what are called incels?
Yes.
Involuntary celibates, men who they cannot find any woman who will sexually accept them, and they're angry about it.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm wondering if you cover that, sort of men having to come to terms that no woman is ever going to sexually accept you, so get over it and live out your life.
Yeah. Right. I was actually going to talk about that a little bit because of the purity culture. I see some clients that I think are budding incels from purity culture because sex was so repressed from them, and they spent so long, like, holding sex as, like, this very important thing. So it's very important to them, and it better be very important to the person that they're going to, like, have sex with. But then they're looking at all these other people that are no longer in that religion because they've also left the religion. And they're like, well, I bet that person had sex. It's like, yeah, this person probably did have sex. They're in their 30s. And they struggle with that. Like, all these other people are having sex and they're not. And it's because of that stunted sort of sexual development due to religion. So I do think, I know that I looked and I saw one study in Canada that was doing some research on religion, purity culture, and incels, and seeing what the correlation between that is, because I do worry that that is something that people are going to start to connect with in terms of this is a growing movement and there seems to be some religious aspect to it. Most of these incels have left the religion, but they're really angry about not being able to have these sexual experiences when most of their peers were. Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about, you're talking here about getting financial support for transition. What sort, how much money are you talking about?
Well, it depends. Hormone replacement therapy is actually not that expensive, and most insurances cover that. But I know, like, testosterone, I think maybe it's $40 a month with outside of insurance. So that's why that's not usually included in that, because most people can afford it. And Planned Parenthood was also offering it. But when you're talking about bottom surgery or top surgery, if insurance is not covering it, it's probably around $50,000. It's pretty, so vaginoplasties are extremely time intensive because you have to dilate the vaginal canal, like, daily, 3 times a day, I think, for like 6 months, and continuing to have follow-up appointments for that. Top surgery is not that expensive. That's pretty easy. But with the phalloplasties, it's multiple surgeries, because first they remove the testes, especially if you've started estrogen, and then there's like pumps that you can put in so that you can actually have erections. Or if you want to elongate the clitoris to have that stimulation. I mean, it's pretty amazing what they can do, but it is multiple surgeries. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
Is there, if somebody's looking for secular therapy, is there a place, like a website or something?
Yeah, seculartherapyproject.com there's, I think, 3 secular therapists in this area. If you want to go to Secular Therapy Project, yeah, there it is. And they have retreats too, recovering from religion retreats that they go on. So I think, is that West Virginia? I am getting a license there, so I might be the only one. And I'm working on Indiana as well. 7, yeah. How many are in, what's in Kentucky? Oh, is it not clicking on? Yeah, so definitely go to this website. It's free to look. You can send them a message, and a lot of them will do online therapy as well. Online therapy is allowed in Ohio, Kentucky, and Indiana. So if somebody's not near you. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.